Sensor Officer K.L. Doran's hands shook over the console as he watched the tactical display flatline in real time. Not damaged, not glitching, simply empty. 41 warships of the Vantrel Dominion 3rd Battle Group reduced to debris and silence in the span of 11 seconds, and the only vessel still transmitting was a single, unremarkable gray ship bearing a marking his translator rendered as USS Meridian, broadcasting nothing but a woman's voice, calm as still water, saying, "Ceasefire and I will let the rest of you leave." And K.O. realized with a cold drop in his gut that she wasn't gloating. She wasn't even angry. She sounded like someone closing a door quietly so as not to wake a sleeping child, and that was somehow more terrifying than screaming would have been, because rage burns out, but this, whatever this was, felt like it could go on forever. But none of this had begun that way. It had begun 6 days earlier in the amber-lit war chambers of Vantrel Prime, where High Marshal Osarin Threx, a scaled and broad-shouldered Vantrel general, whose people had conquered 11 star systems through sheer overwhelming numbers, stood before the Dominion Assembly and dismissed the reports of a human incursion in the Calderis Reach as paranoid fiction, insisting that the species called human had been a fringe rumor for 2 centuries, a bogeyman used by weaker empires to explain their own military failures, and that no single ship, however advanced, could threaten a fleet forged by the Dominion's endless campaigns. Threx had clawed his way to command not through birthright, but through decades of brutal, unglamorous victories, and he did not intend to let a ghost story undo his reputation now. So when Fleet Commodore Ilan, younger, sharper-eyed, and far less certain of Dominion invincibility than her superior, suggested sending a diplomatic envoy rather than a battle group to investigate the strange unclaimed vessel drifting near the Calderis mining colonies, Threx laughed her out of the chamber, calling caution the sickness of the timid, and ordered the 3rd Battle Group to intercept and, if necessary, destroy whatever it was. That decision would haunt him for the rest of his life, though he did not know it yet, because at that moment, aboard the human ship Meridian, its captain, a weathered, quiet woman named Elena Marsh, once a colony administrator and reluctant soldier from a world called New Harbor, that had spent 40 years fighting off raiders alone. After Earth's Soul Compact withdrew support, during what humans simply called the Long Retreat, was doing something far stranger than preparing for battle. She was trying to warn them off, broadcasting on every frequency she could find, pleading, in halting Vantrel dialect, for the incoming fleet to change course. Because she knew something about her own ship that the Dominion did not. Something that made the coming encounter not a battle she wanted to win, but a tragedy she was desperate to prevent. The Meridian was not a warship in the way the Vantrel understood the term. It carried no armor plating worth mentioning, no visible weapon batteries, nothing that Dominion sensors could classify as a threat, which was precisely why Threx's tactical officers laughed when their scans came back clean, mistaking the ship's strange, layered hull architecture for damage rather than design, and it was that laughter, replayed later from black box recordings, that would become the most quoted moment in the entire aftermath, because 30 seconds after the 3rd Battle Group crossed what Elena had marked, in increasingly desperate transmissions, as a boundary, the Meridian's hull unfolded, not weapons deploying, but a field, vast and invisible, humming to life around the human ship like a held breath finally released, and the Vantrel fleet's reactors, one after another, simply stopped. No explosions, no fire, just 41 ships going dark in sequence, drifting dead in space as their crews scrambled in the sudden cold and silence, and it was in that horrible quiet that Commodore Ilan, aboard her flagship the last vessel, still holding partial power, understood with dawning dread that the human ship hadn't attacked them at all. It had simply turned off their ability to attack her, the way you might close a door on a draft, and that gentleness was somehow far more humiliating than annihilation would have been. Elena's voice came through moments later, translated and steady. "I asked you to turn back. I don't want to hurt anyone, but I also won't let you finish what you came here to do." And High Marshal Threx, watching the disaster unfold from a relay station 3 systems away, felt something he hadn't felt in 30 years of conquest. Genuine, bone-deep fear, because an enemy who could disable an entire battle group without firing a single shot was not an enemy his doctrine had ever prepared him for, and worse, this enemy was now offering mercy, which meant either she was lying, or she simply didn't need to kill them to win, and neither possibility let him sleep that night. 3 days after the disaster at Calderas Reach, with 40 of the 41 Vantrel ships drifting dark and one barely limping home, the Dominion Assembly convened in chaos, demanding answers Threx did not have, and it was Commodore Ilan, promoted in the wreckage of her superior's failure, who insisted on doing what should have been done from the start, sending an unarmed shuttle to actually talk to the human captain, a suggestion that nearly got her removed from command until 3 separate assembly members, watching the black box footage of Elena's repeated, ignored warnings, realized that the human woman had tried diplomacy first and been answered with battleships. When Ilan's shuttle finally docked with the Meridian, she expected to find a warrior, a fanatic, perhaps a monster wearing a human face, and instead found Elena Marsh sitting quietly in a cramped, unglamorous command room, hands wrapped around a cup of something that smelled faintly of cinnamon, looking not triumphant but exhausted, the particular exhaustion of someone who has just done something necessary and hated every second of it. "I didn't want this," Elena said before Ilan could speak. "Your people were going to raise the Calderas colonies for the ore beneath them. I read the deployment orders your own supply logs published to open channels. Apparently by accident. And I couldn't let that happen, but I also didn't want to become the kind of person who kills 40 crews to prove a point." And Ilan, standing there in her formal Vantrel uniform, found herself, for the first time in her career, without a rehearsed response, because nothing in Dominion military doctrine had prepared her for an enemy who fought like a surgeon rather than a soldier, removing threats with precision instead of erasing them with force. That was the first of many truths that would upend everything the Dominion believed about humanity. The second came when Ilan asked, carefully, how one ship could disable 41 others simultaneously, and Elena, after a long pause, admitted that the technology wasn't a weapon at all, in the traditional sense, but something humanity had built out of desperation during the long retreat, when isolated colonies like New Harbor had needed a way to stop pirate raids without the resources for actual warships, a field-based system that could sever a targeted ship's fusion containment from its control systems for exactly as long as needed, and not a second longer, designed explicitly to disable rather than destroy, because a colony fighting for survival couldn't afford the political and material cost of turning every skirmish into a slaughter? "We built it to save lives," Elena said, "including, apparently, yours," and that single sentence, more than any threat could have, was what finally broke through Threx's fury back on Vantrel Prime, because when Ilan's report reached him, he realized with sick clarity that his own aggression had nearly gotten his crews killed by an enemy actively trying not to kill them, and that realization curdled into something between shame and awe. The Dominion Assembly, badly shaken, debated for 2 full days over what to do next. Some hawkish members, led by an aging War Council elder named Praxorden, demanded a full retaliatory strike using the Dominion's reserve fleet, insisting that mercy shown once was weakness that would be exploited twice, while others, led by Ilan and a growing faction of officers who had seen the black box footage, argued that provoking a species capable of neutralizing an entire battle group without casualties was not strength but suicide dressed up as pride. The debate turned violent in the chamber itself, when Den, in a moment of raw desperation, tried to seize emergency authority to launch the reserve fleet without assembly approval, and it was Threx himself, the very general whose arrogance had started this crisis, who stopped him, physically blocking the command console, telling the stunned chamber, "I have spent my life measuring strength in how much destruction I could cause. That woman measured hers in how much destruction she could prevent. I will not be the second general to die proving her right," a confession that cost him his pride but, in the eyes of the younger officers watching, earned him something he had never actually held before. Genuine respect? Meanwhile, Aboard the Meridian, Elena received an unexpected transmission, not from the Dominion Assembly, but from a nearly forgotten frequency, reserved for the scattered remnants of the old Sol Compact. A signal she hadn't heard in over a decade, carrying a message that made her hands go cold around her cinnamon-scented cup. New Harbor, the colony she'd left behind to test the very field technology now humming in the Meridian's hull, was under attack by a different, far more ruthless faction entirely unrelated to the Vantrel. Raiders who had learned, somehow, that New Harbor's defenses were down while its best engineer and captain was 3 systems away, proving a philosophical point to an alien empire. And Elena understood, in that instant, that mercy had a cost, and the cost might be the very home she'd built the Meridian's technology to protect. She made her decision in seconds, informing a stunned Commodore Ilan that she had to leave immediately, and to Ilan's genuine surprise, instead of simply departing, Elena asked, not demanded, asked, whether the Vantrel Dominion, humiliated and reeling as it was, might be willing to loan 2 working escort ships to help defend a human colony that had never done the Dominion any harm. It was an audacious request, borderline absurd given the circumstances, and yet Ilan, remembering the sight of a woman who had every reason to gloat instead choosing restraint, brought the request to Threx himself, who, in the single most unexpected decision of his long, brutal career, agreed, dispatching 2 of his own damaged but functional cruisers alongside the Meridian, telling his stunned officers, "We owe her a debt, and Vantrel does not leave debts unpaid." And so it was that a scarred Dominion war fleet and a single human ship that had crippled it days earlier now flew side by side toward New Harbor, an alliance that would have been unthinkable a week prior, arriving just as the raiders began their final assault on the colony's crumbling shield perimeter. And it was there, in the chaos of that battle, that Elena's restraint proved its true worth. Rather than annihilating the raiders outright, she used the Meridian's field to disable their ships one by one, sparing crews who, once stranded and powerless, surrendered without further bloodshed, while the Vantrel cruisers, following her lead for reasons Threx himself couldn't fully articulate even to himself, held their fire except where absolutely necessary. And by the battle's end, New Harbor stood intact, its people alive, its attackers captured rather than slaughtered, and Commodore Ilan, standing on the Meridian's modest bridge, as the colony's rescued citizens broadcast their gratitude across every channel, finally understood what Elena had been trying to teach the Dominion from the very first warning she'd sent days earlier. That true strength wasn't measured in how completely you could destroy an enemy, but in how much devastation you were capable of and chose, deliberately, not to unleash. And it was this lesson, more than any weapon or fleet, that the Vantrel Dominion carried home with them, forever changed. Back on Vantrel Prime, High Marshal Threx stood before the Assembly, one final time, no longer the man who had dismissed humanity as a rumor, and proposed something that would have gotten him laughed out of the chamber a month earlier. Formal diplomatic recognition of the human Sol Compact remnants, not as a threat to be neutralized, but as a people worth knowing, and as the Assembly, still stunned by everything that had transpired, voted to approve the proposal. Elena Marsh sat quietly aboard the Meridian, watching New Harbor's lights flicker back to life beneath her, thinking not of the fleet she had disabled or the empire she had humbled, but simply of the fact that everyone, on every side, had gone home breathing. And when a young Vantrel officer later asked her, with genuine curiosity rather than fear, how she had known mercy would work against an empire built on conquest, Elena only smiled faintly and said, "I didn't know. I just couldn't live with myself if I hadn't tried." And it was that single unguarded sentence, not the disabled fleet, not the rescued colony, not even the historic alliance it sparked, that the galaxy would remember longest, whispered afterward in 100 different tongues, as the moment an empire built on fear finally learned what strength looked like when it chose, of its own free will, to be gentle.